I'd like to shift back, if I could, to, I'm sure we could spend a lot of time following up on that, but let me shift back, if I could, to your basic political theory, political philosophy position. I'd like to ask you a little bit of intellectual history here in terms of your own position. Both of us started out more or less as technical economists,
Yes.
and then we got interested in these more political, philosophical questions. Could you trace for us a little bit your evolution of your own thinking in that respect?
Well, I have a little thinking. It began. Well, it really began with my doing that volume on collectivist economic planning, which was originally merely caused by the fact that I found that certain new insights which were known on the continent had not reached the English-speaking world yet. It was largely Mises and his school, but also certain discussions by Barone and others which were then completely unknown in the English-speaking world, and being forced to explain this development on the continent in an introduction and a conclusion to that volume which contained translations, I was curiously enough driven not only into political philosophy, but into an analysis of the methodological misconceptions of economics, which seemed to me to lead to these naive conceptions of, after all, what the market does, we can do better intellectually. And my way from there was very largely around methodological considerations, which led me back to, I think the decisive event was that essay I did about 37 on, what was it called? Economics and Knowledge.
That was a brilliant essay.
I think that was a decisive point of the change in my outlook. As I would put it now, the conception that the prices serve as guides to action and must be explained in determining what people ought to do. They're not determined by what people have done in the past, which of course was a ecological consequence of the whole modern marginal utility analysis, was perhaps the decisive point, which, as I now see the whole thing, market as a system of the utilization of knowledge, which nobody can possess as a whole, which only through the market situation leads people to aim at the needs of people whom they do not know, make use of facilities of which they have no direct information, all this condensed in abstract signals, and that our whole modern wealth and production could arise only thanks to this mechanism, is, I believe, the basis not only of my economic but as much of my political views. It reduces the possible task of authority very much if you realize that the market has, in that sense, a superiority because the amount of information the authorities can use is always very limited, and the market uses an infinitely great amount of information than the authorities can ever do.
Well, this is very interesting, because what you're telling me, as I get what you're telling me, is that really that it came from an idea rather than sort of an observation of events.
Oh, very much so, yes.
Many people, I suspect, consider your Road to Serfdom, which came out, what, 44 or so,
Yes.
As sort of an observation of things that might be happening, and then...
No, you see, the Road to Serfdom was really an advanced sketch of a more ambitious book I had been planning before, which I meant to call The Abuse and Decline of Reason. The abuse being the idea that you can do better if you determine everything by knowledge concentrated in single power, and the consequent effects of trying to replace a spontaneous order by a centrally directed order. And the decline of reason was a phenomenon which we observed in totalitarian countries. That I had in my mind, and that in fact became the program of work for the next 40 years. And then a very special situation arose in England, already in 1939, that people were seriously believing that National Socialism was a capitalist reaction against socialism. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to believe it now, but the main exponent whom I came across was Lord Beveridge, Sir William Beveridge, as he was then, was absolutely convinced that these National Socialists are capitalists who react against socialism. So I first wrote a memorandum for Beveridge on that subject, then turned it into a journal article, and then used the war to write out what was really a sort of advanced, popular version of what I had imagined would be a great book on abuse and decline of reason, the second part, the part on the decline of reason, adjusted to the moment and wholly aimed at the British socialist intelligentsia, who all seemed to have this idea that National Socialism was not socialism, something contemptible, and just trying to tell them, well, you are going the same way as they do. That the book was so completely differently received in America and that it attracted attention in America at all was a completely unexpected event. It was written so definitely in an English, and it was of course received in a completely different manner. The English socialists, with few exceptions, accepted the book as something written in good faith, raising problems they were willing to consider. People like Lady Wootton wrote a very, in fact with her I have a very curious experience, said, you know, I wanted to to point out some of these problems you have pointed out, but now you have so exaggerated that I must turn against you. In America it was wholly different. Socialism was a new infection. The great enthusiasm about the New Deal was still at its height. And here there were two groups, people who were enthusiastic of the book but never read it. They just heard there was a book which supported capitalism, and the American intelligentsia who had just been bitten by the collectivist bug, who felt that this was a betrayal of the highest ideals which an intellectual ought to defend, and so was exposed to incredible abuse, something I never experienced in Britain at the time. And it went so far as almost completely discrediting me professionally. But in the middle 40s, it may sound very conceited, but I think I was known as one of the two main disputing economists. There was Keynes and there was I. Now Keynes died and became a saint, and I discredited myself by publishing the Road to Serfdom. It completely changed the situation.
Yeah, I've heard you say that you were so surprised by the reaction to the Road to Serfdom. On the other hand, I've heard, I don't believe I've heard you say it, but I've heard people say that you were greatly disappointed by the reaction to the Constitution of Liberty, that you expected much more reaction than you got. Is that right?
That is true.
Do you attribute that to the fact that it was more comprehensive? Maybe it was, you tried to include too much, or what?
It was a book on political science by somebody who was not recognized as a political scientist. It was on that ground very largely neglected by the professionals. It was too philosophical for the philosophers. And see, when I say I was disappointed as regard the range of effect. It was received exceedingly friendly by the people whom I really respect, but there's a very small crowd. I've received higher praise, which I personally value, for the Constitution of Liberty, but from a very small select circle. It had never had any real popular appeal, and perhaps it was too big a book for it, too wide-ranging. People picked out a chapter here and there which they liked. They would reprint my chapter on trade unions because that fitted in their idea. But very few people have fully digested and studied the book.
Well, it seemed to me that you were attacking two quite different things in the Constitution of Liberty and in your 3-volume Law, Legislation, and Liberty. In the Constitution of Liberty, you were going through and talking about particular areas of economic policy, trade unions, taxation, this type of thing, coming out with quite specific proposals for reform. Whereas in the law, legislation, and liberty, you're really talking more about the structural changes in government that would be necessary before we could even hope to put in such reforms. My own thinking would be that these, in a sense, these would be, are reversed.
Well, I don't think you represent it quite correctly. See, in the Constitution of Liberty, I deal with these problems only in the third part, which is the third of the book, just to illustrate the general principles I've elaborated in part 1 or 2. But the other point is that in the Constitution of Liberty, I was still mainly attempting to restate for our time what I regarded as traditional principles. I wanted to explain what 19th century liberalism had really intended to do. It was only at the time when I practically finished the book that I discovered that 19th century liberalism had no answers to certain questions. So I started writing the second book on the ground that I was now tackling problems which had not been tackled before. I was not merely restating, as I thought in improved form, what was traditional doctrine, but I was tackling new problems, including the problem of democracy.
Yes, I do recall that, and I remember that it was only the last part of that book and where you took those particular reforms up, but it seems that in the discussion of that book, that is what has got most of the attention.
Yes, that's perfectly true. But that illustrates perhaps what I said before. The book was too philosophical on the whole, and people concentrated on the parts where it became more concrete.
Yeah. Let me just ask you a little bit now about your view on what I would call social cultural evolution. It comes out in several of your pieces in these 2 volumes of essays, and also in the 3rd volume of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, where you place a great deal of attention on the sort of spontaneous emergence of rules, customs, institutions. And yet, at the same time, you seem to be willing to classify some things that have emerged as undesirable. How do you sort of reconcile these 2 positions?
Well, there's no great difficulty. The things which have been tested in evolution by being selected as superior, selected is even wrong, by prevailing, because the groups which practiced them were more successful than others, by their very origin had proved their beneficial character. What I object to is the attempt to alter that development by deliberate construction from the outside, which is not necessarily wrong, but where the self-correcting mechanism is eliminated. And while if practices go wrong, the group concerned declines, if a government goes wrong and enforces the mistake it has made, there's no automatic correction of any kind.
In this connection, do you consider your own views to be close to, or how do they differ from that of Michael Oakeshott?
I confess I still have, there are 2 new books which I admit in my 3rd volume I ought to have carefully studied before writing it, but if I had done so I would never have finished my own book. This is Nozick and Oakeshott. I sympathize with both of them, but I know only parts of them. Now, Oakeshott I know at least personally fairly well, so I have a fairly good conception of his thinking without having studied his book. I think, put it very crudely, I am a 19th century liberal and he is a conservative. I think that is...
Well, one of your former students, Shirley Letwin,
Yes.
I've talked to her about this problem a great deal, and she always, when she talks about your work in this connection, she always also ties it in with Oakeshott. And so I had assumed there was obviously a closer connection between the two from personal relationships than maybe there is.
We can talk with each other,
Yeah.
Complete understanding, but to my feeling, I may do him injustice. There are in Oakeshott's systems certain hardly conscious general prejudices in favor of a conservative attitude, where it is just his feeling which makes him prefer something without his being strictly able to justify his argument, but he will justify his not justifying it. Or he believes that we ultimately must trust our instincts without explaining how we can distinguish between good and bad ones. My present attempt is to say, yes, we rely on traditional instincts, but some of them mislead us and some not. And our great problem is how to select and how to restrain the bad ones.
Well, now that I'm mentioning people from London, let me also ask you about Sir Karl Popper, whom I saw a month ago, incidentally. Shirley Letwin also suggested to me that you might have been influenced a good deal by some of Popper's work, apparently stuff that has not really been published, but what she calls his evolutionary ethics, or his attempts to develop an evolutionary ethics.
No, I was prior, and I remember a time when Popper reproached me for my evolutionary approach.
That's interesting.
No, the relation is on the whole curious. See, Popper, in writing already The Open Society, knew intimately my counter-revolution of science articles. And it was in these that he discovered the similarity of his views with mine. I discovered it when The Open Society came out. Although I had been greatly impressed, perhaps I go back to as far as that, by his Logic of Scientific Research, his original book. That formalized a conclusion to which I had already arrived. It arrived at due to exactly the same circumstances. Popper is a few years my junior, so I did not know him in Vienna. We were not in the same generation. But we were exposed to the same atmosphere. And in the discussion then, we both encountered two main groups on the other side, Marxists and psychoanalysts. And both had the habit to insisting that their theories were in their nature irrefutable. And I was already by this driven to the conclusion, if a theory is irrefutable, it's not scientific. Yes. Now, I'd never elaborated this. I didn't have the philosophical training to elaborate it. But Popper's book gives the justification for this argument. That a theory which is necessarily true says nothing about the world. So when his book came out, I could once embrace what he said as an articulation of things I had already been feeling and thinking. And ever since, I followed his work very closely. In fact, he once, before he went to New Zealand, I met him in London. He spoke even to my seminar, and we found very far-reaching basic agreement. And I don't think there's anything fundamental with which I disagree, although I sometimes had at first hesitation. His present new interest about the three worlds, at first I was very puzzled about. I believe I now understand and agree. When in that Hop House lecture, I speak about culture as an external element which determines our thinking, rather our thinking determining culture, is, I believe, the same thing which Popper means when he speaks about the third world. And, of course, in the few years we were together at the London School of Economics, it was only from 45 to 50, we became very close friends and see completely eye to eye on practically all issues.
He has written a new book with Sir John Eccles on the self
I've
and the
read
brain,
his part of it. I haven't read Eccles' part, which essentially develops the point I was just speaking about the third world. And
Yes, I remember the Third World lecture he gave in, where was it, in Switzerland, at the Mont Pelerin meeting in Switzerland.
At that time I didn't understand it.
Yes.
It was only since things he has written since which made clear to me, and certain development of my own thinking, which goes in the same direction.